Giles Vernon wasn't born evil. Surely it's fair to say that nobody is. But his childhood was not a happy one. His father was mostly absent, and when he was at home he had no time for his needy son. And his mother Harmony had to play the role of both parents. She was quite the disciplinarian with her three boys and kept a tight hold on the trio. Giles's two siblings were very close to their mum, and as they grew, both boys somewhat idolised her, but the youngest, Giles, grew in his resentment for the woman who was there at every turn, never allowing him to grow and explore and discover, as a young chap should. By the time he had reached his teenage years, he had developed a distinct cruel streak. He used to delight in torturing small animals. On his 14th birthday he thought he would treat himself by cutting off the tail of his neighbour's cat. At school, he was a bully. He would use his obvious intelligence to manipulate a small number of fellow bullies into following his lead. They would target ethnic minorities and smaller boys who had effeminate tendencies. The goal was never to merely put the victims in their place. The targets had to be broken. The targets had to be terrified. Giles and his clique were able to get away with their sadistic behaviour all the way through school. The teachers could see what was going on, but did not intervene. Why? Could it have been because Giles's father Harold was the single biggest donor to Havelock, one of the most prestigious private schools in England? During his early years, Giles found that people were generally cowards who could be easily intimidated and manipulated. He would take these lessons forward. When his father died of an apparent heart attack at the relatively young age of 49, he left his wife and three boys an equal amount of his enormous estate. They were all millionaires. His brothers Tom and Bernard took the advice of their dear mother and immediately put their inheritances into savings accounts. Tom wanted to be a doctor and had already set about his career path before his father's passing. He knew he could rely on his mum for financial support in the short term. Bernard was dead set on joining the Navy, which Harmony had some misgivings about, but remained supportive. It was at this time that the young Giles removed himself from the lives of his family. He needed nothing from them. The young Mr. Vernon had learned many important lessons during his schooling, and had made connections which would last a lifetime. He had discovered pretty quickly that the world was an old boys' club. What were the qualifications for getting into this club? That was simple. You had to be from a certain background and have a certain amount of money. Giles ticked both of the boxes, so he was in. Even though Giles despised his father and quietly celebrated his demise, he was a keen student when it came to learning his dad's business practices. And what was old Harold's business? He was a stocks and shares man. So were the fathers of several of Giles's fellow bullies at Havelock. They stayed close after school, and when they were in their early 20s they decided to go into business together and found their own exchange. After a good deal of initial success, they opened an investment bank in South Asia. Then later, they bought more investment banks. They knew how to game the system and exploit the desperate and the naive. Their success attracted more and more prominent clients, and before long the Havelock clique were billionaires. But for Giles it was never enough. Financial success had given him some pleasure. To know that he had surpassed his father was of course satisfying, but he had to have more. Manipulating and intimidating people were not enough. As he aged, he became more and more interested in the art of hypnosis. When he first approached the subject, he was frustrated by what he saw as a lot of nonsense, but as he delved deeper into the subculture, he found information and people that excited him in a way which was freshly arousing. He went about recruiting and holding secret meetings with two German hypnotists who had gotten into trouble with the law in the fatherland. The two had narrowly avoided prison time. Giles brought Hans Bauer and Evelyn Walter to what was his holiday home on the Pacific island of Fanaboa, with the intention of finding out what kind of people his guests really were. Giles was delighted to find that in addition to their vast knowledge of the subject, they were also morally depraved and had similar tastes to himself. It wasn't long before Mr. Vernon was making plans with his new friends. In a little less than 2 years, Giles established himself on the island and had the corrupt government of Fanaboa firmly in his pocket. They were willing to turn a blind eye to whatever he was doing in exchange for generous monthly donations into the private accounts of various ministers. In a jungle retreat, Giles had commissioned the construction of an impressive compound where he intended to carry out his experiments, and perhaps in time he would invite his more trusted business partners to come and view his work. But the compound and the government were not the only things Vernon owned on the island. He had also invested in a few coastal hotel apartments, the kind of apartments young travellers tended to visit. Vernon built up his staff around the compound and the holiday apartments, and began the process of selecting targets. He knew he had to be careful. Proper screening was needed, and abductions had to be carried out with the utmost discretion. Mr. Vernon found that soon after work had begun, it didn't much seem like work. He had found a project that truly made him happy. Marcus and his girlfriend Fiona had been planning a round-the-world trip for almost 6 months. One problem seemed to be that the details kept on changing. At first, it was just going to be the pair of them starting out in Europe before moving on to Africa. From there, they would fly to Southeast Asia, taking in several beautiful countries as they slowly made their way further south into Indonesia, then Australia. They spoke of going on from there into the Pacific Ocean. Fiji and Samoa were suggested as possible destinations, but later on, among fellow friends and students, the route would change significantly. Marcus would talk about visiting African nations which Fiona wasn't comfortable with, and he was also thinking aloud about going to South America and seeing the mighty Amazon before they cut it all down. Fiona wasn't the confrontational type, but she had her subtle ways of letting her boyfriend know that she wasn't best pleased about the lack of a solid itinerary. Another problem was that they lacked sufficient funds to make a trip lasting several months. They had both been saving for quite a while, but it still wasn't enough. Things changed decisively in an unexpected fashion when Marcus's older sister Susan lost her high-paying job as the company she worked for went bust. In truth, this did not come out of the blue, but when the end finally did come, it was still a sad day. Susan was a financial and business consultant, highly educated and confident. She was not overly concerned by her recent downturn in fortunes, but she had been feeling stressed for the better part of a year. Being aware of her brother and his girlfriend's situation, she tactfully floated the idea that maybe she could join them on their trip of a lifetime and would happily fund 2/3 of the costs. Her only condition was that she could bring her friend Jennifer, fellow consultant at the company which had just gone under. Susan could tell that Fiona was not massively pleased with the idea at first, but at a family and friends get-together one Friday, she took her brother's partner aside and went about talking her around. She assured Fiona that she would do her best to stay out of Marcus and her way, and that she and Jennifer would be off doing their own thing for the most part. Eventually, Fiona agreed to the arrangement. She knew that Susan was excellent at organising things, and would perhaps be a moderating influence on Marcus, who could be occasionally rowdy. But at the same time, she was jealous of the older woman. She was more worldly and confident than herself, and although she never did anything to put Fiona down, she made her feel insecure. Jennifer was a fair bit older than Susan, and had just been through a messy divorce. She didn't have any children, and like her friend, she was financially secure and looking to relax and unwind after a tough year. What was not known to Susan was that Jennifer had feelings for her, which she had not yet summed up the courage to express. This trip would surely provide ample opportunity for the truth to come out. But Jennifer was not the only one with a secret. Susan, too, had a hidden desire inside. But unlike Jennifer, she could not let her secret out into the open. If she did, it could destroy everything. Susan loved her brother, as every sister should, but since an early age, she was aware of her sexual desire for him. During her teenage years, in fact, she found it difficult to repress her lustful thoughts. She was worried that her mother would pick up on the energy she was giving off and would say something. Her mother did have her suspicions, but never felt it appropriate to comment. Susan was on the whole a good daughter, who did well in school and never really caused any trouble. If she was having perverse thoughts, perhaps she would naturally grow out of it, her mum told herself. She was wrong. As Susan aged, the desire seasoned, but did not diminish. She would imagine herself with Marcus, as she was with other men. She was naturally drawn to men who reminded her of her younger sibling. The face and the body type had to be similar. She enjoyed her fantasies, of course, but nothing could ever live up to Marcus. She had resigned herself to admiring him and being a good sister in the traditional sense. Despite her incestuous desires, she was a remarkably well-balanced person with a kind heart. Marcus was completely unaware of his sister's lust for him. He had grown up maybe a little in her shadow, but he didn't have any competitive feelings towards her. He had only happy memories of her always being there with the right kind of advice when he needed it. The two always covered for each other in situations where it was called for. Marcus was quite the ladies' man. He felt he owed a lot to his sister for teaching him about girls and women growing up. Young Marcus now wanted to put his studies on hold for a little while and get out there and see the world he had heard so much about for himself. He was an open-minded and tolerant guy, but was also angered by the current state of politics and what he saw as the many glaring injustices all around him. Fiona shared his passion and his views. This shared worldview had brought them together. Soon they would have the opportunity to meet many fascinating people, from walks of life very different to their own in England. They were excited, of course. The thrill of fear was a part of this. You can plan for one thing or another in life, but you never quite know what's waiting around the next corner. Marcus, Fiona, Susan and Jennifer set off in early May. France was the first stop. In Paris, the adventure would begin. Operations had been running well for a couple of months now, and Giles Vernon was lost in his project. He was learning more and more about the science and art of hypnosis as time passed. He was also learning more about himself. He had often wondered how far he would actually go if given the chance. Well, here he was in his island compound, pushing himself and his partners to go further and further into the dark. Those who had been abducted on Vernon's orders were of a certain type. His preference was for young females. Ethnicity or nationality didn't matter to him, but they had to be young and curious. A few young male travellers had also been taken and brought here. The routine was fairly straightforward. Vernon's agents would search out what Giles would call ideal candidates from the holiday apartments. They would be approached by these agents, who would act as guides offering island tours and general sightseeing. Once they had gained the trust of the young adventurers, they would drug their targets by slipping tranquilizer into their drinks and bring them to the compound to begin the process. Individuals would be put in isolation rooms for the first 12 hours where they would be deprived of external stimulation. For the second 12-hour period, the victims would be subjected to a medium volume continuous beat and changes to the lighting which followed a pattern. The young travellers would be taken out of the room and blindfolded. Individually, they would be taken to another room where Bauer and Walter would administer the oral conditioning. Some victims showed more resistance than others, but after a few hours everyone would break and fall into a trance. Every trace of free will and confusion could be removed by the correct procedure. This is how Bauer and Walter saw it. After this, the victims were stripped naked and taken to the showroom, which was at the heart of the compound. The room had a stage, not unlike in a theatre, and there was room for 20 seats. For most shows, Vernon would sit with his German friends, and a couple of agents would be also in attendance. Giles would stand before this little crowd in a gloating fashion. The helplessness of the victims never ceased to excite and amuse Giles. He loved the idea of good girls having their innocence destroyed. In a warped way, he actually thought he was doing them a favour. Girls would be given direction by Evelyn Walter. One would stand staring straight at Vernon, while another would get on her knees and eat pussy. What impressed Giles was that the girls could be conditioned to either orgasm or not orgasm. They really were his sexual puppets. He enjoyed making these slightly older women perform analingus on the younger ones. Walter would make the performers of the degrading act try to talk, asking them to describe the taste and prompting the ladies to express how thankful they were to be here and have the opportunity to lick and eat ass. Occasionally, young males would be brought onto the stage and directed by Walter to get hard and stay hard until told otherwise. It worked every time, much to Vernon's satisfaction. Several girls would be brought out and paraded naked in front of the small audience. Bauer would tell the conditioned females to ask Mr. Vernon's permission to suck cock. One after another, they begged Giles to be allowed the privilege of giving head. And one after another, they did just that. As with the girls giving analingus, the hungry cocksuckers will be prompted to express their gratitude.